студентам, преподавателям и широкой общественности. Я руковожу этой программой, меня зовут Ксения Прасолова. Если у вас есть какие-то вопросы, какие-то комментарии, вы всегда можете к нам обратиться. Мы находимся на улице Невского в аудитории 115. Мы также надеемся, что таких встреч будет больше, и мы сможем привести больше интересных и талантливых людей для того, чтобы познакомить калининградскую публику с ними. А сейчас я хотела бы предоставить слово заведующему кафедрой истории Илье Олеговичу Дементьеву, который представит нашего гостя более подробно.
Добрый день. Без преувеличения, у нас уникальная возможность увидеть и услышать одного из самых крупных ученых современности, наверное, можно сказать, историка, хотя та сфера, в которой занят наш гость, это сфера междисциплинарная, поэтому можно, наверное, шире сказать, что профессор Бёрк один из крупнейших гуманитариев современности, один из ведущих исследователей культурной и социальной истории нового времени. И это действительно уникальная возможность, хотя в актовом зале, наверное, можно было бы сесть покомфортнее, разместиться, но мы находимся в стенах исторического здания, это здание Кенигсбергского университета, которое было в 1967 году передано вновь создаваемому Калининградскому университету, и в этом смысле наша встреча приобретает такой особенный исторический характер, можно сказать, эпохальный для нашего университета. Профессор Бёрк в течение большого очень времени работает, больше полувека, начинал как исследователь истории итальянского Ренессанса, но затем сфера его интересов заметно расширилась, и он стал одним из ведущих исследователей культуры раннего нового времени, народной или популярной культуры. У него одна из важнейших монографий, к сожалению, до сих пор не переведенная на русский язык, это большое упущение нашего книгоиздательского дела, она посвящена как раз народной культуре Европы раннего нового времени. Кроме того, профессор Бёрк широко известен в мире как теоретик культурной, или вот в последнем русском переводе был введен новый термин культуральной истории, для того, чтобы отличить историю культуры, понятный термин для любого русскоязычного читателя или слушателя, да, история культуры или культурная история, кажется, ассоциируется с высоким искусством, с какими-то шедеврами, с классикой и так далее. А вот культурная или культуральная, или, как по-другому говорят, новая культурная история, она связана с более широким спектром явлений и культуры, и общества, и социокультурными практиками, разными формами, которые культура приобретает в разных общественных контекстах, символами, представлениями, как эти символы влияют на нашу повседневную жизнь и так далее. Вот всем этим занимается профессор Бёрк не только в качестве практика, но и в качестве теоретика, и в качестве популяризатора вот этой новой культурной или культуральной истории. И особенно нужно подчеркнуть, что профессор Бёрк один из тех людей, кто активно продвигает лучшие достижения нашей отечественной гуманитарной науки 20 века. Ну вот в его книге, которая переведена в прошлом году, издана в Высшей школе экономики в Москве, «Что такое культуральная история?», это как раз такое введение вот в предмет, доступное, популярное любому студенту, может быть, даже школьнику понятное, которое об очень сложных вещах рассказывает простым языком. Вот в этой работе, в частности, отдано должное крупнейшим работам гуманитариев 20 века в нашей стране, лучшим представителям российской или, даже, можно сказать, советской гуманитарной науки. Михаилу Бахтину и его работе о творчестве Франсуа Рабле и народной культуре Ренессанса и Средневековья, Юрию Лотману и его беседам о русской культуре и Арону Гуревичу и его работе «Проблемы средневековой народной культуры». Вот достижения российских исследователей, которых не так хорошо знают, не так хорошо продвигают за рубежом. Понятно, что сегодня основной язык гуманитарных наук – это английский язык, но профессор Бёрк – это в том числе один из тех людей, кто отдает должное и помогает всей мировой публике, и англоязычной, в частности, публике, познакомиться с важнейшими достижениями отечественного гуманитарного знания, за что ему отдельная благодарность со стороны нашей российской науки. Таким образом, у нас сегодня уникальный шанс, редкая возможность. Я уверен, что это время не пройдет даром для представителей любых специальностей, потому что слушать одного из ведущих ученых современности – это должно быть не только удовольствие, но и польза для ума в любом случае. Поэтому желаю всем хорошо провести время и выйти отсюда обогащенными опытом общения с одним из крупнейших современных ученых. Спасибо.
Fine. Well, thank you both for the introductions. I'm very happy to be invited to Kaliningrad. I'm very happy to be invited to speak about cultural history in the 21st century, although that is something of a challenge. I am not often asked to speak about the future, and more than 80% of the 21st century is still to come. But as historians always say, if you want to understand the present and the future, you need to look at the past, you need even to look at the remote past. So I'm going to begin my story more than 200 years ago, but I promise that the 21st century will get plenty of attention, at least the first couple of decades. I start in the late 18th century because that is the time when cultural history began. That is, the term cultural history was coined in Germany exactly at the time of Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, Kulturgeschichte. So why invent the new word? There were already histories of painting, music, philosophy, mathematics, chemistry, and so on. But the new idea was to study the connections between different arts and sciences. And the masterpiece of this kind of history was written in the middle of the 19th century by the great Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt. There were going to be names on the screen, but it seems something is, never mind. No. So Burckhardt's masterpiece, the Cultura der Renaissance in Italian, that is, the culture of the Renaissance in Italy. It's been a model for cultural historians ever since. It still sells very many copies, but until quite recently, it did not have much influence inside the universities. Cultural history, although it was invented in the late 18th century, did not become respectable in universities until the late 20th century. Why? Well, after all, the 19th century was an age of nationalism. History was taken seriously in universities on condition it was political history, mainly the history of nations, mainly the history of the particular nation in which the university was. It's only after the First World War that the monopoly of political history in universities was challenged. I think it's fair to say that as the present changes, so historians begin to look at the past in a different way. So after the First World War, there are big economic problems, inflation, the Great Depression. So historians begin to write economic history, hoping to understand what is the cause of these trends in their present. And then, after the Second World War, interestingly, there's a rise of social history. But cultural history remains on the margin. Still, in the middle of the 20th century, I think cultural history was on the margins of academic life. I could give you some examples from Britain. In the middle of the 20th century, 3 important studies of cultural history were written, but none of them by people with a position in history departments in British universities. The first book it became quite famous. It is called A Study of History. It was written by Arnold Toynbee. It was an ambitious comparative study of 21 civilizations throughout the whole of history. Thank you. The second was written by a biochemist, Joseph Needham, Science and Civilization in China. It began to be published in the 1950s. It's still not finished. Needham died, but his pupils, his assistants, continue to produce more volumes. And the third example is a book called The Making of Europe, published by Christopher Dawson. Now, Toynbee did not teach in a university. He worked in a think tank, an Institute of International Affairs. Needham was a biochemist who had actually gave up biochemistry to write the history of science, but the University of Cambridge continued to pay his salary. Yeah. And Christopher Dawson was a freelance writer. So it's marginal people from the academic point of view who practice cultural history as late as the middle and later 20th century. In the universities, the trend was to do social history. And another example of the marginal person, maybe the most important contribution to cultural history in the middle of the 20th century was made by a German sociologist who became a refugee in England, Norbert Elias. After Hitler came to power, he fled to Britain, but he published his major book, which was called The Process of Civilization. He published it in Switzerland, in German, in 1939. And as a result, almost nobody read it for 20 or 30 years. He published in the wrong place at the wrong time. So somebody who's living in England, when it's at war with Germany, and he's published a book in German in Switzerland, nobody can get a copy of the book. And it took until the 1960s for Norbert Elias to become famous. So what did that leave? There was a small place for cultural history within history departments in Britain and elsewhere, especially the study of the Italian Renaissance, exactly the subject that Jakob Burckhardt had chosen to write his great book in the middle of the 19th century. And so, first political history was dominant. Then it was challenged by economic history. Then economic history was challenged by social history. For all this time, cultural history was on the margin. But in the 1980s, things began to change with the so-called cultural turn. So, for a historian, it's interesting to ask, why should the cultural turn have occurred when it did? Well, as I was saying a few minutes ago, when the present changes, we look at the past in a different way. Works of history are often inspired by current debates. At one time, a debate about inflation. Today, debates about the environment stimulate the history of the environment. Debates about globalization stimulate global history, and debates about the knowledge society stimulate the history of knowledge. And the second half of the 20th century in many European countries was a time of debate about popular education and popular culture. And so historians living at that time began to be interested in popular culture. In Italy, a famous example by a friend of mine, Carlo Ginzburg, he published a book with the arresting title of Cheese and Worms, Il formaggio e I vermi. It was about the worldview of an ordinary man who had been totally forgotten, a miller. He had a very personal view of the cosmos. He thought that the earth was like a cheese and that there were worms in it and that these were the angels. And so he was interrogated by the Inquisition. He was executed, but the records of the trial survived to be read by a historian in the 1970s, who then wrote a best-selling book about a vision of the cosmos by the vision of an ordinary man. And in England, there was a famous literary critic, Raymond Williams, who wrote a book called Culture and Society, which, as a kind of open Marxist, Williams was interested in the way in which social change is followed by cultural change. And so this debate about popular culture and the foundation of cultural studies, I think here it's called culturology, this inspired historians, and some of the work of historians in turn inspired workers in cultural studies. You can see the effect of Raymond Williams in one of the most famous historical studies published in England in the last 50, 60 years, Edward Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. Or again, I can speak personally because I was a witness of what was happening in the 1960s when I began to teach in university. And I wanted to write a book about the Italian Renaissance, and so I called it Culture and Society in the Italian Renaissance, as a kind of homage to Raymond Williams. He was one of my intellectual heroes. I didn't know him, but I admired him from a distance, and so I wanted a book title that would echo the title of his book. And it's true that in the 1960s, 1970s, there was an increasing interest in the social history of culture. It was inspired by a kind of Marxism or semi-Marxism. So until this time, culture had meant high culture. It meant Beethoven, it meant Tolstoy, it meant Michelangelo, and so on. And now there was an interest on the part of intellectuals in popular culture. Popular music, popular poetry, popular drama, and so on. But then in the 1980s, the idea of cultural history, it became not only more popular, but it also became wider. Historians working at that time, myself included, were interested in anthropology and in the wide sense of culture as anthropologists use that word. It means not just great works of painting or literature or music. It means the attitudes and values of a given society as they are expressed in everyday life, in artifacts, in practices. Of course, almost everything becomes culture in that definition, and that can create problems. But this widening of the concept of culture was a great inspiration to us historians at that particular time, and indeed a bit afterwards. So this is an international movement. I can bear witness to its importance in Britain, but in the United States it was still better known. The movement that was called the New Cultural History, and a kind of cultural history that was sometimes written by historians, but also by academics from departments of literature, like Stephen Greenblatt, who is best known as a specialist on Shakespeare, but he also writes books about cultural history. And in France, there was a movement called La Nouvelle Histoire, the New History, and once again, it was partly inspired by anthropology and by the wide concept of culture, or in French, civilisation, which the anthropologists had. I should say, now that I've mentioned the New Cultural History and La Nouvelle Histoire, that it may be a mistake if you found a movement to use the word new in the title, especially if you intend your movement to last for more than 10 years, because now the New Cultural History is middle-aged, if not old, but the title has stuck. So now I finally reach the 21st century, and I can tell you, because I've lived through the changes, that they are extraordinary. When I began my career in a history department in the 60s, and I called myself a cultural historian, people looked at me in a rather strange way. What kind of history is that? And by the year 2000, everybody seemed to be calling themselves cultural historians, even if they were working on what I thought was economic history, or diplomatic history, or military history. Books explaining what cultural history was suddenly multiplied in English, French, German, Italian, Romanian, and other languages. Maybe in Russian too, but I don't read it, so I don't know. Books published since the year 2000 in English, which have the words cultural history in the title, include books on an extraordinary variety of topics. I've seen books called The Cultural History of Wine, The Cultural History of Obesity, The Cultural History of the Sea, of the Night, of Terrorism, of the Environment, and even a cultural history of worrying. And recently, an enterprising British publisher, Bloomsbury Books, decided that they would launch a number of series, 6 volumes in each series, covering 2,500 years in 6 volumes and many authors. And they would all be called cultural history. The cultural history of the senses, the cultural history of animals, another series on the body, on gardens, on food, on women, on childhood, on sex. And these series are still being published. And so, in a way, it's quite gratifying. I began my career on the margin, and now I find I'm somewhere near the center, but I didn't actually have to move. It was the world that changed, not me. I never expected this interest in cultural history, which was already strong in the 1980s, to continue as long as it has done. Of course, I'm very happy with this. But I wonder how much longer can this trend continue? It is only prudent to, when one is trying to work out what is happening in the future, to look to see if there are other trends, whether cultural history has rivals. It was new in the 80s. Well, what's new in the early 21st century? Well, the first thing one can say is that the cultural history practiced today is not exactly the same as the cultural history of the 1980s, and still less the cultural history I was beginning to try to practice in the 1960s. There are new topics which attract great attention. I'm thinking of 4 in particular: history of memory, history of the media, history of the senses, history of knowledge. Already there were studies published on these topics in the late 20th century, but in the last 15 years or so, they have become much more important. People talk about the memory boom, and why should there be so many books about memory? And why do these books sell not only in the academic world, but to many members of the general public as well? My guess is this is a result of the increasing speed of social and cultural change. It's become so fast that many people come to feel, when they're middle-aged or older, that they are almost strangers in their own culture, because things are done so differently from 30 years or 40 years before. So they hold on to the past in order not to be swept away by the flood of innovation. They hold on to their own past, the past of their parents and grandparents, and the past of the places where they live. Not only the country, but the region, the town or village, the street, even the house. Because the history of memory is, above all, the history of memory in the last century. There's much less concern with the earlier history of memories. And as you can see from the most famous book published on the history of memory, it's a multi-volume book with many authors, published in French with the title The Places of Memory, Les Lieux de Mémoire. And it was a great publishing success. It was immediately imitated by the Germans, the Italians, the Dutch, the Belgians, and then I lost count. Second major topic then, the history of the media. Once again, a new present encourages a new past. So today, think of all the debates about the digital age in which we are living. That encourages studies of communication in the past. History of printing, history of the radio, history of television, and now beginning the history of the internet. Earlier studies focused on the inventors of new technologies, like Gutenberg. But more recent studies place the emphasis on reception, histories of readers, histories of listeners, histories of spectators, and their part in the production of meaning. In France, a friend of mine, Roger Chartier, is a leader of this kind of history of the book and history of reading. And you can see the influence of today's preoccupations on the study of the past. There's one recent French book about the early history of printing, the age of Gutenberg. And deliberately, this historian uses contemporary phrases. He talks about startup, he talks about takeoff, and he calls the Rhineland the paper valley of the 15th century, on the analogy of Silicon Valley more recently. It's anachronism. Anachronism is supposed to be forbidden to historians, but what you could call creative anachronism is a way of bringing the past to life, making the reader or listener aware of certain analogies between a situation in the past and a situation in the present. The third approach I mentioned, history of the senses, sometimes combined with the history of the emotions. Again, the studies began before the year 2000. I'm thinking particularly of one very original French historian called Alain Corbin, who made his reputation with a history of smell. Of course, it is more exactly a history of attitudes to different smells in 19th century France. When he finished that, he decided to write a book about sound, about church bells in French villages in the 19th century. He placing these, the bell ringing in the context of what he called the paysage sonore, that is, you could say, the soundscape, all the different sounds you would be likely to hear in a French village or a French town in the 19th century. Cities were already noisy places, but the noises were simply different noises from the ones we are used to, or the ones which we try to be used to today. And fourth kind of new cultural history, my favorite, the one I try to practice myself, history of knowledge. Located at the crossroads between intellectual history, social history, cultural history. It's become commonplace to talk about different cultures of knowledge. Research groups, institutes, chairs in the subject have been founded in the last few years, from Germany to Australia. New fields often develop out of old ones, and the history of knowledge is gradually emerged out of the history of science. but it's much wider, much more ambitious. So what began as a history of the natural sciences expanded to include the history of the social sciences, and now it's expanded to include everybody's knowledge, including the knowledge that we don't know we have, implicit knowledge, the knowledge that you need to ride a bicycle. You've learned it, you forgot that you learned it, you just do it. But actually, without certain kinds of knowledge, you would simply fall off. Well, the implicit knowledge changes over time, and so it's a fit subject for history. And a phrase that recurs in these studies is that of an order of knowledge. It's an intellectual order concerned with the way in which knowledge is classified in different cultures. But again, it's got another meaning, which is the social order of knowledge, or if you like, the institutional order of knowledge. For example, histories of history have long been written, and they used to be written in a traditional manner as the lives of great historians. And today, there's much more interest in the places in which history is produced. So what about the history of archives, the history of libraries, the history of departments of history in universities, the history of the societies in which amateurs discuss the history of some subject that particularly interests them. And once again, the emergence of a new field, the history of knowledge, looks like a response to current debates. In this case, the debate about whether we now live in a knowledge society or a knowledge economy or an information society. And that kind of debate has stimulated historians to ask new questions. And so the recent decades have been a success story in the history of culture, but as historians know very well, successful trends never last indefinitely. So it's time to look about the intellectual world and to ask ourselves, and of course as a cultural historian myself I have to do this, are there rivals emerging on the scene? In 10 years, in 20 years, will people be interested in something quite different? And there certainly are other new trends in historical thought, historical writing today. The most obvious, the history of the environment. More difficult to discuss because these trends are very new and important studies have not yet been published. But there's a movement towards biohistory and a movement towards neurohistory. Neurohistory, informed by neuroscience, is part of a movement called deep history. And the relation between history and biology was the subject of a round table organized by the American Historical Review in 2014. That's one of the leading historical journals in the world. So if they ask 6 people to discuss a trend in print, it means it's being taken seriously. Now, the reason I mention these approaches in a lecture which is supposedly about cultural history is that the biohistorians and the neurohistorians have one important feature in common. They are reducing the importance of culture. That is, they offer explanations of human behavior that place less weight on what changes and more weight on what doesn't change, or maybe what changes only over the very, very long term. Maybe the structure of the human brain has changed in the last 100,000 years, but not really in the 5,000 years which historians are generally most interested in. It's very interesting to see that the idea of evolution, social, cultural, historical, it was so popular in the 19th century, it was rejected so strongly in the 20th century, and now it appears to be creeping back. In the writings of some archaeologists, some anthropologists, some sociologists, some linguists, some psychologists, you find more and more references to cultural evolution. It's true that evolution is now defined a bit more precisely than before. That is, there's more emphasis on what is called social learning. There's more emphasis on what's been called cultural selection. It's not the same thing as natural selection. For example, it would be possible to rewrite the history of war in this way. That is, you study the way in which the people who lose learn from the people who win, adopt their techniques in the hope that they will win the next time round. In the case of war, the survival of the fittest seems to be literally true. In other cases, cultural selection needs to be explained by the action of individuals or groups with the power to accept or reject new ideas. That takes us back to the history of knowledge. So studies of social or socio-cultural evolution are reshaping cultural history rather than replacing it. But that reshaping is quite a radical one. It means moving away from hermeneutics, the art of interpretation, and moving towards sociobiology. So, in the history of knowledge, as in the case of history in general, as in the case of knowledge in general, we often see a swing of the pendulum. The cultural turn of the late 20th century owed something to disillusionment with economic determinism, disillusionment with Marxism. The rise of cultural history, I believe, was encouraged by the fall of the Berlin Wall. As the pendulum swung, the claims that were made for culture and the claims that were made for cultural history were sometimes exaggerated. And so, it always seems to happen like this. After a time, the pendulum starts to swing the other way. And as a cultural historian myself, I would be quite happy to admit that in our enthusiasm for our subject, maybe we have placed too much weight on cultural differences and their effect on history, at the expense of what remains constant or what changes only very, very, very slowly. But now we see a movement in exactly the opposite direction. It privileges the very, very, very long term at the expense of the medium term, at the expense of the short term. I don't know what's going to happen with these movements of biohistory and neurohistory. It's too early to say, because people have written a lot about what might happen, but they haven't yet produced the actual histories inspired by these approaches. Maybe in the next 10 years they will appear. So it's much too early to make a judgment about the value of these approaches. But as an old-fashioned cultural historian, I simply hope that the pendulum will not swing too far. Thank you. Because I've got something in my ear already which I can't take out. Thank you. I hope, yes.
Does it work? Does it work?
Yeah.
Check.
Yeah, yeah. The first history of chemistry I know was published in Germany in the late 18th century. Sorry. Right, so my answer to this question would be, yes, the history of science, or the history of different sciences, is related to cultural history, but in an indirect way. The history of chemistry goes back to the late 18th century, but it was written in an internal way, without much interest in the effect of non-chemistry on chemistry. Whereas I think the ideal of cultural history is to show the connections between everything. History of science, generally, it began to be institutionalized already in the 1920s in Harvard and elsewhere. And it was only the history of the natural sciences, but that inspired other people to write the history of the social sciences. And out of that, there's been the inspiration to write the still wider cultural history of knowledge. So we see a movement, something highly specific, leading to something more general, leading to something even more general. So indirect connection, very strong.
Professor, Профессор Бёрк, меня зовут Алексей Давиденко, аспирант кафедры истории. Большое спасибо вам за возможность прослушать уникальную лекцию о культурной истории. Спасибо нашему университету за возможность организовать такое мероприятие. Вопрос у меня, наверное, два вопроса в одном. В своей лекции вы упомянули людей, которые, не будучи историками, писали историю. Вот в контексте самой культурной истории, на ваш взгляд, кто ее должен писать? Профессиональные историки или же специалисты широкого круга? Лингвисты, географы, может быть, философы, филологи? И если специалисты широкого круга, то какова все-таки в таком случае роль историка и исторической науки? Большое спасибо.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question, which is already a very big one. And I have never believed that history should be left entirely to professional historians. I think professional historians do have an important contribution to make, but all sorts of other people have ideas about the past which can be valuable. And in the history of knowledge, we have often found that original ideas come from people who began by being trained in one discipline, and then they move into another one, and they take with them the habitus, the habits of thought of the first discipline, and that means that they can see things which other people can't see. And so if I name a sociologist like Norbert Elias, he had things to say about history which the professional historians at that time had never thought of saying. I think that's a recurrent phenomenon, not only in history, but in other disciplines as well. And as for the role of cultural history today, I think it is increasingly important. The more that cultural globalization takes place, the more cultural encounters there are, because it's become even more essential than it used to be to understand the mentality, the way of thinking, the culture of other people. Because we're constantly in contact with them, we need to understand them, they need to understand us. And a discipline which is focused on differences in culture and how we can understand differences in culture seems to me then to need no further justification.
Thank you. Can I also ask a question? On your left hand. Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting lecture. And I have two questions. First of all, you said that the turns in culture trigger the turns in society, right? Could be the other way around. Maybe the turns in society or turns in other parts of our life change the turns in culture. And maybe you think that only because it's your particular subject, so you have this approach, right? And the second question is, you also said that, or I believe that cultural history focuses on like local cultures or particular areas like Renaissance or others. And there are like other historiographical approaches like global history and others. Isn't there some sort of contradiction between them? These are the questions.
Thank you. So your first question reminds me of something that Roger Chartier said, you know, that the French have a gift for expressing themselves in epigrams. And Chartier said, today, which meant the 1990s, we have moved from the social history of culture to the cultural history of society. Your second question about, you raised the example of urban history. urban history can be written in many different ways. There's an economic history of cities, there's a political history of cities, there's a social history of cities, but I think too there is a place for the cultural history of cities. That is, the effect on people who live in big cities. Does it transform their habits of mind as well as their daily life in a more practical sort of way? So I don't think of cultural history as separate from a study like urban history. They overlap and they interact. And I think this would be true if you cited many other examples. And that maybe explains something that I used to find very strange, but I've got used to it now, which is that some of my colleagues, whom I think of as economic historians, say that we're really cultural historians because we're interested in the mental attitudes which encourage or discourage economic growth and so on. So we need specialization, but it's very important, I think, that the different specialities inside history don't put up barriers between them.
Наверное, если будут еще вопросы, можно будет позже сделать. Я бы хотел тоже поблагодарить профессора Бёрка за лекцию, сказать, что сегодняшняя тематика его выстроена в определенной логике. Первая лекция посвящена общим процессам, которые протекали в мировой историографии в новое время, особенно в 20 веке, и как теоретическая рамка культурной истории формировалась. Во второй лекции профессор собирается сосредоточиться на взаимоотношениях историографии и соседних, смежных общественных дисциплин, антропологии, социологии. И это уже на некоторых примерах из практики ученых, там 3 ученых заявлено, на некоторых примерах он попытается охарактеризовать и состояние взаимодействия между дисциплинами, и перспективы его. Мы сейчас объявим небольшой перерыв. У меня большая просьба. Профессор хорошо знаком с явлениями раннего нового времени, карнавальным дурачеством, охотой на ведьм, еврейскими погромами и тому подобными замечательными явлениями европейской истории. Поэтому ему, наверное, не привыкать к тому, что люди могут себя вести по-разному. Да? Но если у вас есть намерение покинуть лекцию незаметно или есть желание заняться какими-то другими более важными делами, то большая просьба сделать это по возможности в перерыве между лекциями. Да? Потому что, несмотря на то, что профессор Бёрк, несомненно, знаком с этими чудесными практиками массового исхода людей специфической культуры, тем не менее, это ясно, что отвлекает любого лектора, да, любого преподавателя. Поэтому, независимо от того, сколько человек останется в аудитории, да, уверен, что это будет важным моментом в профессиональном становлении любого из нас. Потому что лекции крупных ученых важны не только своим содержанием, которое может быть для нас не всегда интересно или даже не всегда понятно, да, но важны также прежде всего своей формой, да, способом структурировать материал, манерой изложения, замечательным в данном случае, понятным очень многим, мне кажется, в зале английским языком и так далее, что не часто бывает с англичанами. И в этом смысле я очень прошу сейчас прерваться на 10 минут, да, до 35 минут 12-го, и остаться в зале потом тех, кто готов выдержать вторую лекцию. Большое спасибо. 1 minute is okay. No, you have 1 minute. So drink it.
Okay, I'm going to start again. Yes, in this second lecture, I should like to talk about the relation between history and the social sciences. Actually, I would prefer to say history and the other social sciences. Though when I use the word science, I mean Wissenschaft, that is, organized knowledge. I don't mean that historians or indeed sociologists should attempt to imitate the methods of natural scientists. Actually, there's more than one model for the study of nature anyway. And so, again, like a historian, I want to talk about this relationship in the past, in the present, and perhaps too in the immediate future. So start, as in the last lecture, by saying something about the past. In the 19th century, economists, sociologists always studied the past as well as the present. They did not necessarily have much respect for historians, but they did have respect for the past. One British sociologist said the value of historians is simply that they make the bricks, and we, the sociologists, then assemble them into the building. But in the 20th century, there was a rejection not only of historians, but also of history. I think the break came especially in the 1920s, 1930s. What occurred was what Norbert Elias, whom I mentioned last time, this German sociologist, refugee in Britain, what Elias called a retreat into the present on the part of sociologists and other social scientists. In the case of theory, functionalism became dominant. That is, the explanation of all social phenomena by their function in the present. The function especially of maintaining the social system. In the case of practices, methods, the 1920s were a turning point, especially in anthropology. So the great Polish anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski introduced this method of fieldwork, that in order to write about a tribal society, a society without writing, it would be necessary to live there for more than a year, listening, observing. But of course, if you study a society that you don't know by living there and looking and listening, your conclusions are all about the present. You can't listen to, you can't see the past. And a similar method was introduced into sociology, especially to urban sociology, by the so-called Chicago School, also in the 1920s. And so an exciting new method for studying the present had, maybe as an unintended consequence, a loss of contact with the past. And then again, in sociology, there was a greater interest in developing a social theory which would always be true, which would be true everywhere, which would be true at all periods. That was the ambition of Tulker Parsons at Harvard. Whereas in an earlier generation, the great German sociologist Max Weber studied history intensely, but Parsons in the next generation turned away from it. And the development of quantitative methods in sociology widened the gap between sociology and history. Again, in economics, it was very close to history in the 19th century. There was the so-called German historical school. They believed that economics was simply economic history. But in the 20th century, there was a reaction against this. Once again, quantitative methods, but also the desire to develop mathematical models of economic behavior. And the analysis of that's called rational choice theory, as if rational choices are the same in every place and the same in every period. There's an interesting recent book published with a rather dramatic title, How Economics Forgot History. In the study of politics, it's a similar story. The study of politics used to be very close to political history. But in the middle of the 20th century, the two disciplines diverged. Political scientists became interested in quantitative methods, for example, psephology, the study of elections. And they also began to be fascinated by mathematical models, for example, game theory. It's of great interest to people in politics departments. But of course, once again, that means generalizations which apply without considering where you are, without considering what period you're living in. Now, what I want to talk about is not so much this retreat into the present as a more recent reaction against it. To what extent has there been, or should there be, a revival of interest in history among sociologists, economists, specialists in politics, and of course, the other way around. To what extent is it important, if you are a historian, to be studying the other social sciences? Geography, economics, politics, sociology, anthropology, and so on. You might call this reaction the advance into the past. It's the complementary opposite of the older retreat into the present. Of course, I don't have the time to deal with all this in detail, but in different countries and at different moments, both the retreat and the advance took place rather differently. In Italy, for instance, there was never such a break with the past as there was in the United States, in Britain, even in France. So clearly, it's a complicated story because each discipline has its own history in each country in which it's been practiced. And I have to be simple because I have to be relatively short. So what I am going to do is to talk about only three disciplines: history, sociology, anthropology. And I'm only going to talk about three countries: France, Britain, the United States. And simplifying still further, I shall concentrate on only 3 moments. So 3 moments in 3 countries and 3 disciplines. I want to talk about what I call the moment of Fernand Brodel, 1950s onwards, the moment of Norbert Elias, 1960s, and the moment of Clifford Girц from the 1980s. I don't mean to imply that these 3 individuals, although they were extremely gifted and extremely influential, I still don't want to imply that they caused these movements. They did make a difference, but the transformation of their disciplines, first history, then sociology, then anthropology, they were collective movements, and they had different sources of inspiration. So these 3 names, treat them as symbols of collective movements. So first I'll talk about the moment of Fernand Brodel. The 1950s, or to be more precise, I could say 1958. That was the year in which Brodel published an article which is more like a manifesto. It was called History and the Social Sciences. It argued very strongly in favor of collaboration between all the social sciences. Of course, this article did not emerge from nowhere. Its author, Brodel, was the leading figure of the 2nd generation of a very important movement of historians in France, associated with the journal Annales. So we could call this the movement of the analystes. A movement directed against the dominance of political history in France until that time, and in favor of what Brodel used to call histoire totale, that is, a history of all human activities and not simply the political events. So, 2nd generation, because this movement had been founded in the 1920s by 2 older historians, Lucien Febvre, Marc Bloch. And they too believed very strongly that historians had a lot to learn from their colleagues in economics, sociology, and geography. Brodel also believed that historians could learn from these other disciplines, but Brodel went further because he also asserted that people working in all the other social sciences had something important to learn from history. So, Bloch and Febvre wanted to renew the study of history. Brodel, more ambitious, wanted to renew the study of all the social sciences. He argued they were in crisis. Each of them was trying too hard to distinguish themselves from all the other social sciences. And he thought, in fact, there would be much more progress in understanding society if these barriers between the social sciences were torn down and if history was admitted to this general debate. In the language of the 1950s, you could say what he wanted was a common market of the social sciences. Some people said, maybe maliciously, he wanted this as long as history was the dominant discipline. He's often been accused of disciplinary imperialism. If that's true, we don't have to follow. We can approach this problem in a more egalitarian way. The important thing is the interaction between people who have a different training and yet are often dealing with very similar problems. Anyway, Brodel was asked to write a report for the Ministry of Education, and he proposed the creation of new positions at the institution he directed, which was the 6th section of the École pratique des hautes études. In other words, he was outside the university system, but he was in an academic research institution established in Paris. The government, for its part, wanted to spend more money on the social sciences because they thought that the reputation of France in this area was not great enough, that the North American model was dominant, that the French also had something to say. So there was a happy coincidence between what the French government wanted, and one can say what they were prepared to pay for, and the intellectual ambitions of Brodel. So what he suggested to the minister was the creation of posts in regional studies, beginning with 20th century Russia and 20th century China. And this would be jointly financed by the French government and the Rockefeller Foundation. For the Rockefeller Foundation, this project was easy to understand because it belonged to what the Americans called area studies. Area studies in general, and studies of Russia and China in particular, were being supported in the United States in the 1950s as part of the strategy of the Cold War. It's on the principle, you must know your enemy. And that was why the Russian Research Center in Harvard was founded in 1948. Now, Brodel knew about area studies. He visited the United States in order to see how they were functioning in practice. He liked the approach in some ways. He liked the interdisciplinarity because the Russian Research Center joined economists, political scientists, and sociologists in a joint enterprise. But Brodel was also critical because history had been left out, geography had been left out. So he decided he would follow the American initiative, but he would do things in his own way. That is, he would encourage people in the center he was founding to view contemporary economic, political, social problems in the perspective of history, including what he called the longue durée, the long term, that is, not decades, but centuries. I can't resist telling you a rather amusing story at this point. The Rockefeller Foundation tried to control the institutions which they were helping to pay for. And then they objected to two of the scholars that Brodel wanted to appoint in Chinese studies. They objected to the Hungarian István Balázs because he was a specialist on the 12th century. And the Rockefeller Foundation said, what's that got to do with the problems of the present? And then they objected to a French scholar, Jean Chesneau, because he was a member of the Communist Party, and in the 1950s that set the alarm bells ringing for the Americans. But Brodel was a very tough character, very decisive, and he always got his own way. And so he said he was going to keep these two scholars, and the Rockefeller Foundation unwillingly let him have his way. So that's an important movement for interdisciplinary cooperation that was launched in the 1950s. Now I'm going to move to more or less the 60s, which I call the moment of Norbert Elias. His moment should have been the 1930s. As I was saying to you a few minutes ago, it was in 1939 that Elias published his most important book, a study of what he called the process of civilization, by which he meant the rise of self-control. That is, the establishment of social mechanisms for self-control, which he associated with the rise of the centralized state and what he called the taming of the wild nobility. But as I said before, when he published the book, nobody took any notice. It was only after the Second World War that gradually an interest in the work of Norbert Elias developed, first in the Netherlands, then Germany, then France, and funnily enough, only after that in Britain, although he himself was teaching in Britain. He was an unlucky man in many ways, and he got his first permanent job as a sociologist when he was 57 years old, so not so far from retirement. But luckily, he lived a long time into his 90s and was able to enjoy the rise of his international reputation. Like the people he most admired, Max Weber and Karl Mannheim, the Hungarian sociologist who had fled to Germany in 1919, and Norbert Elias was his research assistant. Like them, he was convinced that history and sociology could not be, should not be separated. As I say, he was a strong critic of what he called the retreat into the present. His book on the civilizing process began in the 15th century, ended in the 18th century, thus illustrating the concern with the longue durée, the long term, that Brodel was always speaking and writing about. I think it's very sad. It reveals that academic communication does not always cross international frontiers very easily. It seems that at least until the very end of their lives, Elias knew nothing about Brodel, and Brodel knew nothing about Elias, although they would have made great allies in their joint project. Anyway, the story has a happy ending, because by the time that he retired from the University of Leicester, Elias had taught a number of graduate students who went on to become major sociologists in Britain. And a few of these students learned the lesson about the indivisibility between sociology and history. They wrote books about sociology which made use of history again and again. Anthony Giddens is one. Stephen Manell is another. And Elias was also successful in the Netherlands, which is the place where he lived after he retired. So there's the historical sociologist Houtsblom and the historical anthropologist Anton Bloch, both personal friends of Elias and in a way disciples of him. I have to say that the majority of British sociologists, and maybe the majority of sociologists in the world today, have remained unconverted. But at least we can speak of a group of historical sociologists who between them have published a series of important books over the last 30 years or so. Just as one can speak of a group of sociological historians. I think one of the leading historical sociologists today is British, though he taught in the United States, that is Michael Mann. And in the United States, there is a significant minority of sociologists have taken history seriously. The most famous, I think, and the leader of the group is Barrington Moore, who was a professor at Harvard, and he became famous for a book which he called The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. It was a comparative study of Europe from the 17th century onwards. And two of Moore's students moved in a similar direction. The first of them, Charles Tilly, wrote his doctoral thesis on a movement of rebellion in the 1790s. In those days, in the United States, a PhD in sociology that took an episode out of the French Revolution was quite an unusual thing to do. And for the rest of his life, teaching at the University of Michigan, Tilly always combined sociology with history. Then there was another student, a younger student of Barrington Moore, Theda Skocpol, and she stayed at Harvard and is best known once again for a comparative historical study, actually, of three revolutions: French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution. So she was trying to develop a theory of revolution, but she was taking specific historical examples very seriously. And then the next generation, a student of Tilly's, interestingly enough, a Japanese student who came to the United States to work with him, Eiko Ikegami. She's published a couple of very remarkable studies of historical sociology, one of which is called The Taming of the Samurai. And that, although she doesn't talk about Norbert Elias, it's very clear that she is talking about in the Japanese equivalent of what he famously called the civilizing process. The state becoming more powerful and the warrior nobility being forced into a more peaceful way of life. I should say one more thing about Barrington Moore. He was a Marxist, but of course it wasn't so easy to be a Marxist in the United States, and he probably kept his head down in the 1950s. But in the more relaxed atmosphere of the 1960s, there was no problem for a professor at Harvard to be inspired by the ideas of Karl Marx, even though the Cold War was still going on. And this is also true for another American scholar who it's difficult to describe in disciplinary terms, and that is Immanuel Wallerstein. Wallerstein has always been very interested in economics, but he took his PhD in sociology, and he specialized in the sociology of Africa, especially Northern Africa. And then he realized, he says, he would never understand the history of Africa without understanding capitalism, and that he'd never understand the history of capitalism unless he went back at least as far as the 16th century, or more exactly 1492, because he was interested in a global history of capitalism in which the discovery of America and the import of African slaves into the Americas played a crucial role. And so that path led Wallerstein to read Brodel and then to meet Brodel. And these two scholars, who began with very different interests, found that they had a lot in common, and each took ideas from the other. Wallerstein has become famous for what he calls world system analysis. But this world system analysis is always based on history, especially the history of the last 500 years. One might say that sociology and history were destined to be partners, because in both disciplines, some scholars have always been concerned to attempt to see the big picture, either in space or in time, or both. Anthropology, on the other hand, was traditionally concerned not with macro social trends, but with small societies, face-to-face groups, villages, small communities. So the partnership between anthropology and history is less predictable. It took longer to establish, but it has, in the last generation or two, turned out to be extremely fruitful. So that brings me to the third moment, the moment of Clifford Girц. An American anthropologist who became amazingly influential outside as well as inside his discipline, and in a number of countries. Following the publication in 1973 of a collection of essays that he called The Interpretation of Cultures. That collection of essays was not explicitly historical, but then in 1980, Giertz published a study of Bali in the 19th century, a book which he called it An Anthropology of the Theatre State, because at that time Bali had a royal ruler. But I want to emphasize he didn't do this alone. Giertz was not the only important figure in the reversal of Malinowski's rejection of history. Giertz, who used to teach in Princeton, had a great rival who used to teach in Chicago, Marshall Sahlins. Although the two men disagree about almost everything, they do agree on one thing, which is that anthropology and history are closely linked. Where Giertz writes about Bali, Sahlins prefers to write about Hawaii and Fiji. But a similar historical turn was made by other American anthropologists at this time. I can't remember whether I put, yes I did. Eric Wolf and Sidney Mintz. Again, those are two North American Marxists. It's worth remembering as part of the intellectual history of the 20th century that there was an influential group of Marxist scholars in the United States in the 1960s, 70s. In Britain, anthropologists were rather slower to make the historical turn. But there's one dramatic example from my own university, Cambridge, Jack Goody. For the first half of his career, Jack Goody was an orthodox British anthropologist. He did his field work in Western Africa, more exactly in northern Ghana, and published a succession of interesting books about a people tribe, if you like, called the Lo Daga. And then in mid-career, he reinvented himself as a historical sociologist or anthropologist and started to write about the difference between Eurasia and Africa, a difference which he believed began in the Bronze Age. Europe and Asia experienced the Bronze Age, which went with the rise of cities and writing and economic development. But Africa did not participate, and that the effects of that separation thousands of years ago, he says, can be felt ever since. Meanwhile, some historians had been making their anthropological turn. So from the 1970s, there was a movement among a group of historians in favor of what has become known as microhistory, study of small communities, sometimes over a long period. One British historian wrote the history of a single village over 1,000 years. But more famously, Carlo Ginzburg, the Italian historian I mentioned in a few minutes ago, he was the leader, still is the leader, of a group of Italian microhistorians. In the United States, one thinks of Robert Darnton, who taught at Princeton, and he taught joint seminars with Clifford Girц. They became great friends. And Natalie Davis, also a historian in Princeton, and also close to Clifford Girц. There was a similar movement, still is, in France, that they call anthropologie historique, led especially by Jacques Le Goff, a famous historian of the Middle Ages, who died about a year ago at the age of 90. And then in England, one thinks of Keith Thomas, who wrote a book about witchcraft and the decline of belief in magic in the 17th century. And a student of his, Alan Macfarlane, he was the only academic I know who has a PhD in history and also a PhD in anthropology. So, if you like, he is bilingual in the language of two different disciplines, but he's particularly interested in connections between the two. But of course, this is an international movement. In Russia, its most distinguished representative was, I think, Aaron Yakovlevich Guryevich. But then in Germany, Hans Meydick. In Scandinavia, again, historical anthropology has inspired a number of important books. Sorry, my voice is giving out. I just drink for a moment. I think, in a way, you could say the importance of the link between history and anthropology is different for the two parties involved. For historians, it's books by anthropologists that are the source of inspiration. We can't do field work in the past, but we can ask questions about the past of the kind that anthropologists ask, but then we have to find the answers in a different place, in the archives, rather than by personal observation. But the other way around, for anthropologists, it's not historians who are the inspiration, it's history. That is, what they realized that they needed to do was to see beyond the present and beyond the boundaries of the small communities which they lived in to do their fieldwork. They needed to locate these communities in a wider space and a longer chronology. And so they too have started to go to the archives. They begin with their fieldwork, and then they ask, how did the society that I've been observing, how did it become like this? Was it like this 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Back to the archives to discover. So, well, there's just time to say a little bit about the future. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of these three moments. Even today, decades after the moment of Clifford Girц, the majority of historians, at least the ones that I know, show little interest in the social sciences or the other social sciences. And the majority of social scientists show little interest in history. I've been talking about minority movements. In the United States, where sociology is a very large profession, it is split into many different groups. So historical sociology is simply a kind of sociology alongside about 30 other varieties. It hasn't penetrated the discipline as a whole. So what about the future? The possible future. And of course, the great problem in talking about the future is the danger of mixing up two different things. There's what one would like to happen, and there is what there is reason to believe will actually happen. One needs to be realistic and separate the two. So my hope for the future, but it is just a hope, is that exchanges between different disciplines will multiply, and above all, that individuals and groups working in the different social sciences will become more aware than they are at present of the importance of the past in the present and of the importance of social and cultural change in the long term, not decades, but centuries. Because I firmly believe that if we want to understand structures, events, or trends, they may be, whether they're economic or political or social or cultural, we always need to take into account what might be called three dimensions of analysis. Geography, where is something happening, and chronology, when is it happening, and sociology, to whom is it happening. So when I say chronological, I'm thinking of the time dimension in all its many varieties. What a Russian sociologist in exile, George Gurevich, no relation of Gurevich, what he called the multiplicity of social times. While the French historian Fernand Brodel liked to distinguish between what he called the time of events, the time of social structures, and the very long time of what he called geohistory. And again, in order to understand culture and society, I think it's always necessary to combine a macro analysis, a bird's eye view of the big picture, with micro analyses which are close to the ground, that is, they're close to human experience. They offer concrete details. The great challenge is to reveal the connections between those big social and cultural trends and individual lives. Norbert Elias formulated the ideal very well. He described his method on one occasion as to make macro structures visible by conducting research on microstructures. And of course, we aren't equally competent at all these tasks, which is why cooperation and even collaboration are needed in one form or another. Now, as I think the example of Fernand Brodel and the Rockefeller Foundation suggests, ideas become more effective if they are embodied in institutions. And indeed, the reason that I chose this particular topic for a lecture here today is precisely because this university is reviewing its projects for the future. And so it has a chance to play a role in this movement of rapprochement between history and the social sciences. It could do this if it simply made that enterprise part of its future programs. Thank you. Just get ready to listen.
Спасибо большое за лекцию. Александр Куликов, факультет социологии. В первой части своей лекции вы говорили о взрывном развитии объектного поля культурной истории. Во второй части для решения этой проблемы возникла как таковая междисциплинарность. Во второй части вы говорили о том, что
Is there a way of making the sound louder? It's fainter than it used to be.
Можно погромче?
That's better. Yeah. Sorry, there's a question.
В первой части своей лекции вы говорили о взрывном развитии объектного поля культурной истории. Во второй части о том, что для решения этой проблемы возникла, по сути, междисциплинарность, и междисциплинарность вот в лице, например, Броделя уперлась в границы, и Бродель говорил, границу нужно разрушать междисциплинарности. Вы, как ученый междисциплинарного характера, насколько я понял, скажите, вот с вашей точки зрения, современная классическая междисциплинарность, не уперлась ли она в какие-то границы? Не возникла ли необходимость создания какого-то нового, я назову так, агента, некого нового формата, технологии, который бы вышел за границы междисциплинарности и был бы более актуален и более, наверное, отвечал нынешним реалиям?
I'm afraid I didn't follow that very well. Would it be possible for you to summarize that question in one sentence, and then I'll try to respond?
Вы, как ученый междисциплинарного характера, скажите, не уперлась ли современная социальная междисциплинарность в некие границы? Не возникла ли необходимость создания нового формата за границами междисциплинарности, который бы более был современный, динамичен и отвечал реалиям времени?
Yeah, I'm tempted to say that the international exchange of ideas is at once necessary and impossible. Impossible is too strong, but I just want to emphasize the great difficulties imposed by language, because the central concepts in different disciplines don't have quite the same meaning. When English people talk about culture, when Germans talk about Kultur, when the French talk about civilisation, these concepts have different associations in the minds of scholars in these different places. I can't give a Russian example because I don't know the Russian language. And this continues to impose great difficulties, the possibility of misunderstanding what one's neighbor is saying, even when it's been translated into one's own language. But nevertheless, I think that we have to keep trying.
Thank you.
Спасибо большое за лекцию. Мой вопрос в следующем. Учитывая популярность междисциплинарного подхода и использование методов антропологии и социологии в исторических исследованиях, не приведет ли это в будущем к тому, что история как наука потеряется в антропологии, в социологии и, может быть, в каких-то других гуманитарных знаниях?
Sorry, I couldn't understand what the translator was saying. Sorry, could you speak louder? This is the translator. Yeah.
Can assist you translate this.
Yeah, okay.
So, considering the popularity of disciplinary approaches, is there an opportunity in the future that the history will be lost because of this anthropological approach?
Okay, I think there is no need for this to happen. But yeah, I would want to make a distinction between the fact that interdisciplinarity as a slogan is become extremely fashionable, and that even in the United States and elsewhere, centers of interdisciplinary studies have been set up. And I don't think that that's very valuable. I think what is valuable is informal exchanges between people who have been trained in one discipline but have their minds open to the possibility of learning from other ones. So history will only be lost if historians don't get a voice in this interdisciplinary meeting. We have to work to make sure that this happens. The problem is that, of course, quite a lot of historians are quite uninterested in this kind of exchange. But a minority of historians are, and to that extent, I have a modified optimism as far as the future is concerned. Yeah.
Марина Шендерюк, доцент кафедры истории. Уважаемый Питер, нам понятно, что культуральная история, несмотря на макроанализ и междисциплинарные исследования, все-таки не ставит задачу выработки какой-то универсальной модели развития общества. Все-таки мы знаем, что с начала античности в историографии всегда такие попытки предпринимались. Но мы, как так сказать, бывшие советские историки долго придерживались формационной такой модели, хотя она тоже, понятно, потерпела фиаско. Считаете ли вы, что нужно стремиться к выработке некого такого универсального закона развития общества, и есть ли перспективы у таких задач? Спасибо.
No, the Russian was louder than the English, so.
So this is the building of the historical department and she said that macro level the task was to make the universal law global, but as the former Soviet
The possibility of
the universal law of development.
One theory was Marxism.
I have to admit that I'm very suspicious of universal laws of history, and in that I'm a fairly typical empiricist English historian. When an attempt was made to do this by Arnold Toynbee, it was very interesting to see how historians reacted in reviewing the different volumes of his major work, A Study of History, because they would say, we are very impressed by every part of it except the part on which they've studied themselves and which they said he was totally wrong about. Of course, there's a difference between a single scholar attempting by himself to formulate universal laws of the whole of human history and the possibility of teamwork. But I'm not sure that I believe that there is much chance of a team of scholars who are asked to formulate these generalizations ever coming out with an agreed list of laws. And once again, I wonder whether that there are these laws waiting to be discovered. It's a question of how great a variety of human behavior do you believe that there is in the world? The greater the variety in space or time, the less chance there is of formulating these laws. Only if you happen to believe not only that human nature is fundamentally the same, but even that human customs are fundamentally the same in different places and times, would it be possible to formulate these rules. I don't know enough to reject this idea, but I have to admit that I approach it with a certain degree of skepticism.
Башкирцева Юлия, кафедра философии.
Just about, but the Russian is
So I can just say,
yeah,
so
yeah.
Bashkirtseva Yulia, the Department of Philosophy.
Yes. What about philosophy?
No.
Я могу продолжать?
Oh, yeah, fine.
У меня вопрос касается вот какой сферы. Не возникают ли у вас проблемы категориального аппарата, проблемы, связанные с пониманием? Поскольку, первое, разные науки и ученые, которые говорят на разных языках, и вы только что сами сказали, что действительно понимание культуры, все, что с этим связано, с культурного процесса, может очень сильно отличаться в зависимости от языковой среды. Дело в том, что вот сейчас, работая по теме арт-менеджмента в сфере искусства, ну, в смысле, он так и звучит, я столкнулась с тем, что большинство работ, которые у нас выходят, там какой-то жуткий микс вообще из понятий. вот, из терминов, которые там используются, ну и так далее. То есть вот что у вас с этим в плане междисциплинарных исследований? Спасибо.
So I have a problem concerning with the note. You have a problem with note because you studied various sciences. We're talking about various scientists, various languages, and is there a problem in the understanding of the culture? Because there are certain differences between various cultures, between various languages. For example, management, and this is how it is called, and there is a mixture of notions, of terms.
Yes, it's a complicated situation because not only are there different cultures in which different languages are spoken, but the academic world is also divided. The disciplines are themselves really rather like cultures and have something very like their own specialized languages. So in the process then of trying to understand another culture, and one goes to other disciplines in order for assistance, but then one has, it's almost as difficult to learn the language of the other discipline as it is to learn the language of the other culture. That doesn't mean that the task is impossible, but we just need to remember that there are these obstacles in our way. Most people are not like Fernand Brodel, who, although he was trained as a historian, had this enormous appetite for understanding approaches to human society in this whole cluster of different disciplines. But we need more people like that. Okay.
Еще вопросы? Пара последних шансов.
I am very pleased to have an opportunity to ask you one question. How do the sociologists in Britain see the future development of the human civilization? Would it be the way towards transhumanism, or maybe return to traditions, I mean the Chinese way of development? And how do the psychologists, the scientists see the future development of this civilization?
So she asked from the point of sociologists what the development from the point of view of sociologists, how will be the development of the current situation? What future prognosis is?
Yes, what I see in the current situation of sociology is that historical sociology has become accepted at the price of becoming one specialization among others. What I would like to see is what Norbert Elias wanted to see, which is that the whole discipline could be penetrated by history. So that, for example, an industrial sociologist might begin with an ethnography of work in a factory, but then would stand back from this and say, what had to happen in history to establish a factory with these formal and informal rules. Now, since I'm not a sociologist and don't go to the annual congresses of sociology, I don't really have my ear to the ground. So I know what I would like to happen. I honestly no clear idea about the chances of this happening in the not too distant future. Maybe somebody here can tell me what the current trends are and whether the climate is changing and making history more acceptable among sociologists.
What do you think about multicultural, number one? Now we have crisis of multicultural in Europe, and at the same time we have normal situation. Multicultural. We have normal situation in the same country like in Canada or Australia. Do you think multicultural, is it good for civilization or not?
That's in English, but I didn't hear it because it's too distant.
So he asked about multiculturalism. So
I can speak Russian, no problem.
So how do you see the situation within the sphere of multiculturalism? For example, it can be.
Yes, there's a big ambiguity in the term multiculturalism because sometimes people use it simply to describe a state of affairs and other people use it to describe a policy. Now, so I'm sure that in the first sense of the term, there is more and more multiculturalism in the world because there is more and more migration in the world. And so more and more countries have minorities of people whose first language is not the national language and who have a different culture in the sense of different habits of mind and so on. But then in the second sense, there is the question what policy to pursue. I can only speak about my own position, which is somewhere in the middle. That is, I think that when migrants come to a country, there should not be pressure on them to abandon their culture. And if people are over a certain age, I don't think there should be any pressure on them to learn the language of the country. It's really too late, and they're welcome to learn if they can, but we shouldn't discriminate against them if they can't. But it's very important that the next generation, the children, learn the national language and learn about the major institutions of the national culture. I think that I believe in a citizenship test so far as it's confined to the political knowledge that you need to have to be able to exercise your vote in a rational manner. Not long ago, out of curiosity, I got hold of a copy of the new British citizenship test, and I was half amused and half shocked by the fact that I would probably fail it. There are all sorts of questions about sport which I can't answer and which I don't think are necessary simply for an immigrant to become a good British citizen. So that puts me in the middle between the assimilationists on one side who want anybody who arrives on the island to conform to its traditional culture, and the people on the other side who feel that immigrants should be not only allowed but even encouraged to keep their separate cultures when they arrive.
Последний, наверное, вопрос.
I would like to ask about such a moment. All the names that you have mentioned, they are of European descent. Are there any works about this topic in places such as Latin America, Asia, and just places that are less well developed than Europe and the USA?
So I heard Latin America and Asia, but not the first thing.
So she said that you are of European descent.
Yes.
So she asked you, are there any works you were talking about, for example, in Latin America?
Yes, let me start by talking about one part of the world outside Europe that I know tolerably well, and that is Brazil. The Brazilians have the habit of admiring foreigners, particularly the French, but not only them. And for example, Brazilian historians, sociologists, anthropologists have been very much influenced by the trends either in Paris or Harvard or New York. So they are definitely part of the story. Indeed, if I wanted to be exotic, I could have made most of the points that I made with a single Brazilian example, but so you give me an excuse to mention this. Gilberto Freire was a many-sided man who could equally well have been described as a historian, a sociologist, or an anthropologist. Since he worked, he lived by writing his books and writing for the newspapers, so he didn't have a chair in a university, and so he wasn't confined by a university department. I mean, I'm certainly not against either universities or departments, but there is a price to pay for belonging to a department, and Freire was not prepared to pay it, and the fact that he was outside helps explain how he managed to write these books which integrate the insights not only of the three disciplines I mentioned, but also of geography and different kinds of psychology. And again, there would be interesting things to say about India. In the 1960s, I was lucky enough to be a colleague at the New University of Sussex in England of a brilliant Bengali historian called Ranajit Guha, who once again had enormous curiosity for what was going on in other disciplines. He spoke brilliantly, but we thought he wasn't going to publish anything. But after he left the university, he founded this group called Subaltern Studies, which published about 10 or 12 volumes, reinterpreting the history of India, particularly in the age of the struggle for independence, in a way that was very much informed by sociology and anthropology. So if one was writing a history of interdisciplinarity, I'm quite tempted to try to do this if I have time. Then both Freire and Guha would have an important place in it. And I'm quite sure that if I knew more about some other countries, there would be something interesting and important to say about scholars in those other places. However, one human lifetime is finite, and with the best will in the world, one can't know about everywhere. I regret this, but all one can do is be conscious of one's limitations.
Так, ну что ж, Наверное, все вопросы основные исчерпаны. Да? Я бы хотел поблагодарить нашего лектора и аудиторию, которая провела в интенсивной работе и весь перерыв, фотографируясь неутомимо с докладчиком и выслушав эти две лекции. У меня тоже 3 момента есть для ума, души и тела. Для ума мы получили довольно большой объем информации. Понятно, что наш лектор постарался в самых общих чертах охарактеризовать актуальное состояние гуманитарных и общественных наук и их перспективы. И здесь сформировался такой своего рода список, как вот знаете, у Бродского был список книг, которые обязательно должен прочитать каждый. Так здесь вот есть список книг, которые упоминались нашим лектором. Большинство из этих книг вообще-то переведено на русский язык. И вот эти авторы, которые здесь представлены, во многом хорошо знакомы русскоязычному читателю. Есть, к сожалению, некоторые работы классические и у самого профессора Бёрка, и те, которые он называл, скажем, вот Кита Томаса о ведовстве, ведьмах и ведьмаках, или Теды Скотчпол, сравнительный анализ французской, русской и китайской революции, они, к сожалению, пока еще не переведены на русский язык, поэтому этот список все же потребует и некоторых языковых навыков для того, чтобы освоить его. Но в любом случае тот, кто следил внимательно за ходом рассуждения лектора, да, смог найти для себя оптимальную траекторию, чтобы войти вот в самое сердце современного гуманитарного знания. Это для ума, нам остается задание на дом. Для души, вернее для очистки совести, я бы попросил всех не забыть сдать наушники, у кого они есть. На выходе вот тут справа около окна будет пункт приема этой тары. И для тела физического, тех, кто готов в качестве волонтеров выступить, я бы очень попросил и готов скоординировать эту работу, вернуть многочисленные стулья, похищенные нами по всему зданию, для того, чтобы можно было принять участие. Вот те, кто готов в силах, уходя отсюда, забрать несколько стульев, не вынося их из здания, прошу вас подойти. И большое спасибо профессору Бёрку за